These stories are first-hand accounts shared by Reddit users, detailing unsettling real-life encounters that left lasting impressions. Each narrative provides a chilling glimpse into moments of danger, survival, and eerie coincidences that might make you rethink your surroundings. Disclaimer: these accounts were originally published by Reddit users and are presented as personal experiences. While they're described as true events, their accuracy relies on the original storytellers. The details shared here are intended for awareness and cautionary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. Story 1. When I was a kid, everyone I know played a horrible prank on me. This is something I should probably be speaking about with a therapist, I know. I would, or I have been, but that's not really an option anymore. In fact, I couldn't tell you how many times I've told this story to various medical professionals. I'm 30 now, 20 years since it happened. I just wanted to stop. I was a pretty average kid, I think. A little weird, but every kid is a little weird. I had an older sister, and we fought like two cats. I had a couple good friends, most of whom lived on my street or one street over, and we would meet after school and play until it was time for dinner. My life was fairly ideal. I played soccer, I think. Honestly, I have a lot of trouble remembering much of my childhood. But I remember that I got a Nintendo DS for my 10th birthday, and we had a big party in the backyard. Practically the whole neighborhood showed up. My birthday was just before school got out for the summer, so the air buzzed with excitement, and the evening was warm and felt more alive than other nights. The grown-ups started a fire in our little fire pit, and they sat around it and drank beer while we ran around. I was allowed to stay up past when I usually went to bed, and the other kids chased fireflies with me and roasted marshmallows until late. I remember going to bed happy, excited for summer, and exhausted. I fell asleep quickly, the peel-and-stick glow in the dark stars and moons shining on the ceiling above my head. Waking up the day after my birthday, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I hadn't had a nightmare, wasn't that? I had slept better than I could really remember ever sleeping. It was late, I realized. That must be it. My mom usually woke me up around 8 if it wasn't a school day. She said it was a good habit to be in the routine of waking up early and starting your day on the right foot. By the light streaming in from my windows and the slightly muggy heat in the room, I figured it was already 10 a.m. or so. I smiled, sliding out of bed. It must have been one final birthday treat, letting me sleep in. She had let me sleep in the day before too, of course, although on my birthday itself, I had wanted to get up as early as possible. "Mom," I called into the hallway, poking my head out the door. No answer. I frowned. It was Saturday, so my dad was definitely already at work, but my mom wouldn't be. My sister wouldn't be home either. She had left the night before to spend the night at her friend's house. She was 13 now, and allowed to have sleepovers, for which I was eternally jealous. I decided she must be out front in the garden. I put on a shirt and left my room. I smelled coffee, but there was none left in the pot. There were dishes in the sink, too, with remnants of egg stuck to a pan. It wasn't necessarily alarming, but it was strange. Even on days I slept in, there was always breakfast left over for me. I opened the front door, opening my mouth to call out to my mom, but I instantly froze. Halfway up our walkway was the mailman. He was on the ground, sprawled out awkwardly on the cement. Fresh blood pooled beneath him in a gruesome splatter. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move. His limbs were bent at horrible angles, his face pointed away from me. It almost looked like some omnipotent force, had lifted him into the air and then slammed him back down. The package he must have been delivering lay a few feet away, the cardboard dented and soaked in red. I didn't need any confirmation he was dead. It wasn't a question. I had never seen a dead person before. Sometimes my parents had watched horror movies, but that hardly counted. I backed into the house and closed the door behind me. My mind was racing too fast, and my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. Everything in my body was reeling, so much so that all I could do was move slowly in a faux sense of calm. "Mom," I called out again, into the silent house, my voice breaking. "Mom, are you home? Something happened outside. Mom." No one answered. The house felt way too quiet. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I had to brace myself against the wall as I made my way to my parents' room, because I was almost shaking too hard to hold myself up. "Mom." I pushed open her bedroom door. It creaked, the sound almost deafening against the silence that blanketed the room. Our old gray cat, Gumbo, weaseled her way through the crack and slipped out into the hallway, brushing against my leg on her way. I saw a lump in the bed. For a moment, I thought it was just pillows, but then I realized it couldn't have been. The bed was made, and all the pillows were accounted for, leaning against the headboard. "Mom, are you asleep?" It came out as a whisper, even though it wasn't like I had been trying not to wake her up. I wanted her awake, badly. I think I just somehow already knew. Something was hanging in the air, this heaviness, like the whole world had been blanketed in a thing that was empty and hot and dead. A desert popped into my head, a place that was so far away from everything and completely devoid of anything. Devoid of life. When I pulled back the covers, the shock washed over me like an electric zap. Every one of my veins and bones and muscles felt 20 degrees hotter than they should have been. There was blood everywhere. I could barely see any section of the sheets that wasn't soaked in it. It looked like the cherry juice we sometimes made from the tree in our backyard, squashing the berries with our hands and laughing as the sticky syrup trickled down our wrists. Her eyes were open. Her mouth was wide open, like she was about to scream. I gagged, stumbling backwards and almost falling down. My legs felt like they wouldn't work anymore. I was in a daze as I stumbled back to the kitchen. The eggs on the pan seemed like they were mocking me now. I knew my parents had told me what to do in an emergency, but all of that was gone from me now. This didn't feel like an emergency. It felt more like a horrible nightmare. I pinched myself on the arm, just in case. The neighbors, that was it. I was supposed to call my neighbors. The number was on a sticky note next to the phone. My fingers shook as I dialed the number. They picked up after 3 rings that felt like they took 1 year each. I heard a sort of crackling sound, like someone was moving the phone around. "Hello. Hi." I cleared my throat, trying to get rid of the lump firmly lodged at the back of my tongue. "This is Jackson from next door." I heard some sort of giggle, a choked one, like they were trying to hold it back, and then some hushed whispering. "Hi, Jackson," the voice said. I assumed it was the mother, Mrs. Winston. "Is everything all right? Can I help you with something?" As something happened, my mom." "Oh, honey," Mrs. Winston said, her tone gentle, but something about it felt deeply off. My stomach twisted. "Why don't you head on over here, HM? We'll figure out what's going on together." "Okay." I remember hanging up before she said anything else. Something about her voice was unnerving me. Still, I didn't know where else to go. I slipped out the back door, so I wouldn't have to walk past the mailman, Gumbo watching me go. I knocked on the neighbor's door. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I stepped into the flower beds, peering in through the windows. Someone was lying on the couch, their head tilted back like they were staring up at the ceiling. For a moment, that was what I thought was happening, until I saw that their chest was opened up like a patient on a surgery table. All guts and organs and blood, so much blood. It was Mr. Winston, in his sweater vest and brown dad shorts. Dead like the mailman. Dead like my mom. Something came over me, and I burst through their front door. It was unlocked, which I hadn't really expected, so I went tumbling into the room, landing on my stomach, my face slamming into the floor. Face to face with Mrs. Wilson, who lay dead in front of the phone. Her eyes were open too. There was a fly on one of them, crawling across the white, pausing every few seconds to rub its hands together. I had started to cry. It was finally hitting me that this was real, not some dream, and I desperately wanted my mom. I scrambled to my feet, nearly throwing up when I realized my face was covered in her blood. I swiped at it with my hands, trying to wipe it away as quickly as possible. Then, instinctively, I licked my lips. Horrified, I braced myself for the coppery taste of the blood on my tongue. But it never came. It was sweet. I hesitated, trembling incessantly, before cautiously raising one of my red fingers to my lips. Sweet. Memories flooded my mind, memories of baking with my grandmother, the sweet syrup we would sometimes pour into the mixing bowls. It was fucking corn syrup. I ran to my father's work, which was on the other side of town. By the time I got there, I was close to passing out and drenched in sweat, but it had made it a little easier to get here with the road completely devoid of cars. There were some parked on the side of the road or every now and then in the middle of it, but none of them had people in them. Some of them had blood. Thick and red and gooey blood. The nice receptionist that was always at the front desk and always gave me candy when my dad brought me in had her head against the computer. Her hair was matted with red liquid, as if someone had ripped out entire chunks of her scalp. Before I could think too hard about it, I wiped my finger across the side of her head and licked it. It was sweet, too. I felt like my brain was going to break, like I was standing on the edge of something completely incomprehensible. I shook the woman. She flopped like a rag doll. I sobbed, shoving her, and she slumped to the ground, her head knocking against the tiles. "Wake up!" I screamed at her. "I know you're not dead." She didn't move an inch, just stared, unblinking, her mouth hanging half open. I ran into the room my dad usually worked in, scanning it for his workspace. I couldn't remember where it was, just that it was around halfway back and close to the wall. In every cubicle, someone was dead. Sometimes they looked halfway peaceful, as if they'd been caught by surprise, but most of them were eviscerated in one way or another. Entrails hanging out, bones showing, blood sprayed against the walls, even some with faces ripped clean off. It was like something unseeable had swept through the town on a rampage. But all of their blood was made of corn syrup. In a brave moment, I even touched one of the organs, something that looked like a strange deflated balloon, and it jiggled, but more like plastic than a human body part. At one point, I swore I heard a giggle behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. I found my dad at the water cooler, sitting against the wall, cone paper cup still gripped loosely in his hand. He stared straight ahead, blood leaking from his eyes, nose, and mouth, like he'd exploded from the inside. "Dad," I whispered, grabbing his shoulder. "This isn't funny. Please stop." There was a strange look on his face that I could just barely make out through the red. Almost like a smile. Like a smile someone would only make if they were trying very hard not to. I walked back home, down the middle of the road, balancing on the yellow lines to have something to focus on, because I was fairly certain if I stopped walking, I wouldn't start again. When I got there, I climbed into bed and I closed my eyes. I didn't know what else to do. Eventually, after what must have been hours and hours of lying there, I drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke up to someone shaking my shoulder. I screamed, scrambling away from them, immediately wide awake and terrified. "Whoa!" My mom backed away, smiling. "Sorry, buddy. I didn't mean to scare you." I was breathing hard. I looked her over, clutching my chest. She was completely fine. She looked at it, at least. She stood there in a white blouse and blue jeans, her hair tied up like always, her eyes bright and happy. What day is it?" Her smile faded, and she frowned a little. It was then that I noticed the smell of bacon wafting in from the kitchen. "It's Sunday, Bud, remember? 2 days after my birthday. So yesterday had been real." "What happened yesterday?" She placed the back of her hand on my forehead, tooting softly. "Did one of those neighborhood kids you play with get you sick, honey? Do you feel okay?" I dropped it because I didn't know what to say. I convinced myself maybe I really was sick. Maybe it had been some kind of feverish hallucination. And I was so relieved to see her, I didn't want to think about any of it anymore. I went to eat breakfast, sitting at the table between my dad and my sister, and everything was normal. But when I left the house later that day, I saw it. On the walkway leading up to our house, there was something pink on the pavement, a faint pink stain like something sweet and red and sticky had been recently scrubbed away. Like I said, it's been 30 years. I've been feeling like I have almost recovered from that incident. I had asked everyone I knew countless times about that day, but none of them seemed to have any idea what I was talking about. But still, I had almost let it go, and it had never happened again. Not until today. Today, when I walked into my therapist's office, it seemed strangely quiet. There was usually music playing, something soothing and soft, and there were people in the waiting room and at the front desk typing on a keyboard. But today, nothing. No one. Silence. I let myself into Dr. Sheldon's office, perplexed, which is when I found her dead on the carpet, her blood sprayed across all the walls, even dripping from the ceiling. It was crazy, I know that, but I immediately tasted it. Sweet. I rolled her over, and her eyes were open, a strange smile on her face. This time I did something I didn't think to do as a kid. I checked her pulse. She's alive. I don't know what to do. I can't believe they're doing this to me again. Do they think this is funny? Story 2. There is always a death in my family on November 13th. My name is Dustin, and in my family, the date November 13th has always spelled death. In 1994, it was my grandmother. In 2004, my stepmother. In 2014, my father. Every 10 years, like clockwork, each death is darker than the last. And now it's November 12th, 2024. Just a few hours left until midnight. I haven't slept in 3 days. I remember the first death vividly. I was just 10 years old in 1994 when Grandma passed. 5 days before she died, she kept saying someone was standing near the main door, then near her bedroom. We thought it was just her poor eyesight or dementia. She could barely see the food on her plate, after all. But she'd interrupt her own stories, glancing nervously at nothing in particular, whispering, "She's come again." One night, while she was telling me her usual bedtime tale, she stopped mid-sentence, stared at the hallway, and started gasping for breath. I remember panicking, fetching water, calling her name, splashing her face. She finally opened her eyes and whispered in terror, "She's going to kill me." The woman standing right by the attic stairs. I looked. There was no one. I told her so. She said, "Look again. The glass of water will fall off the dresser." I turned back to look at her. "There's nothing happening, Grandma. The glass is right there." And the moment those words left my mouth, crash. The glass hit the floor and shattered. I screamed and ran. The bedroom door slammed shut behind me. My parents didn't believe me. "You imagined it," they said. "You're just a child." But I knew something terrible was coming. 2 days later, we found her body in the attic room, curled up in the far corner, her eyes and mouth wide open, frozen in fear. I was never the same again. By the time I was 20, life had drained any concept of normal from my soul. I came home from college one evening and rang the doorbell. No one opened the door. I used a spare key. The first thing I noticed was that the attic door, always shut, was slightly ajar. Inside, under the rafters where Grandma had died, sat my stepmother. Her back was rigid, and her face turned away. She was rocking slowly, muttering. I called her name. No response. I stepped in closer. Her skin was pale. Her lips quivered. Then she turned and whispered, "Your grandmother told me everything. She won't leave us alone. She'll kill us all," over and over like a chant. I tried pulling her away, but she felt impossibly heavy, like she had sunk into the floor itself. When I finally got her out of the attic room, the dresser inside rattled, then a glass flew off and shattered just like before. She pushed me out, slammed the attic door shut, and locked it. I called my father, who rushed home. His face was pale, almost icy. Without a word, he handed me a bundle of white cloth, shroud fabric. Then he walked to the closet, pulled out incense sticks, and murmured on the phone, "Yes, the strongest ones. Lavender base, if possible." Then, to me, "Stay away from the attic. I'm going to break the door." I will never forget what I saw next. My stepmother, hunched under the slanted ceiling, was chewing on glass. Blood ran down her chin. She smiled at us, but her eyes were weeping. Before we could stop her, she slit her own throat with a glass shard. Blood sprayed across the walls. She bled out within minutes. The date? November 13th, 2004. My father arranged the funeral, forbidding me from going near her body. He tried to keep me safe. But no one can protect you from something like this. By 2014, as the next November approached, I lived in constant dread. Every creak in the house made me flip on all the lights. I avoided mirrors, shut the attic, and barely slept. On the night of November 9th, my father seemed different, quiet. He didn't speak much, didn't eat. On the 10th, he locked himself in his room. By the 11th, he wouldn't even respond when I knocked. I found him talking to himself in the garden, seated under the old oak tree, the attic key in his hand. He said he was speaking to her, the one who haunted us, begging her to spare me, apologizing for the past. That night, he made tea and hummed lullabies. Too calm. On the night of the 12th, I fed him dinner and stayed in his room. When he went to the bathroom, I waited, but he didn't come back. I knocked. No response. I broke the door. Inside, the walls were scratched with one line repeated over and over. It was my fault. My father was gone. I saw the garden window open. Rushing outside, I found him kneeling in the dirt, muttering prayers. Then suddenly he began digging, bare hands tearing into soil. I tried to pull him away, but he shoved me back with a strength I didn't know he had. He lay inside the shallow pit and whispered, "Take care of yourself. She's come for me." Then he grabbed a nearby brick and smashed his own skull. He died before I could scream. That brings us to now. It's November 12th, 2024. It's nearly midnight. I must have dozed off despite everything. When I woke, I heard voices. The house was full. Relatives. Dozens of them. They were smiling, chatting like it was a celebration, but no sound came from their mouths. I stepped out of my room and into the hallway. No one noticed me, until they all did. Every face turned toward me. Then came through the crowd, my grandmother, my stepmother, my father. They walked up to me, their eyes sunken. Their expressions are blank. Grandmother whispered, "It's your turn now, Dustin. You can't escape." I woke up screaming. It was 9:40 p.m. Then I heard it. The attic door creaked open. The scent of incense, the same night blooming jasmine, which was there for every death, filled the air. A diary lay on the attic floor. Inside it, handwriting I'd never seen before. A confession. The woman I'd called mother all my life wasn't. She was my father's second wife. My real mother was my father's first wife, and she died shortly after giving birth to me. Poisoned, dehydration induced by a night blooming jasmine. Left to suffer, bound in the attic. My grandmother had arranged it. She wanted a daughter-in-law with a dowry. And when my mother became inconvenient, they got rid of her. As I read those last entries, I looked up. A woman stood in the attic corner. Not threatening, not angry, just looking at me calmly, in peace. Maybe I'll survive tonight, because vengeance has already been served. Story 3. I didn't go missing. I'm hiding. I want to start this off by saying I'm sorry. I didn't warn you. Anyone else, either. To be honest, it never even crossed my mind. I was too focused on getting away. To my parents, my friends, my colleagues, my dog, and most of all to you. I'm sorry. It all started about a year ago. Maybe a bit longer. I can't remember. These days, it seems like I'm forgetting everything. That's no surprise to me. That was the first day that those things were on the news. It was like an apocalyptic horror movie brought to life. Giant, misformed creatures, like a mixture between a werewolf and a shadow. They had blood-red eyes and faded into the night. You could spot their eyes from 100 meters away. And if you saw them, they saw you. And the smallest bite, the smallest scratch, and your transformation would begin. These things were multiplying and fast. They couldn't be combated. It took 6 days for alerts to reach the furthest corners of the planet, and 12 days for a global military treaty to commence. And it wasn't enough. These things weren't humans. Bullets would bounce off their skin like steel. The armies serve as nothing but giant stacks of feed. In the next 3 days, estimated numbers went from 1,000 globally to more than 30,000. It seemed hopeless. The entire human race put together couldn't stop these things. They were called demons by civilians, and a good number had abandoned their homes to live in more secluded areas. It seemed hopeless until we caught a glimpse of them in the sun. Previously, they would run away whenever sunrise was approaching. The only time they retreated. It was believed that the armies were doing some sort of damage to them, which is why funds continued, rather than mass evacuation. But the distorted echoes of agony, as tons of shadowy flesh melted into pools of dark blood, was enough to make even the strongest soldiers break down. The sounds, they later admitted, would never be forgotten. This was the key solution. Sunlight. UV light. Once word spread out about this, armies began putting together giant beams of ultraviolet light. Tens of millions of lumens. Pure devastation. The creatures would melt in agony from the light, even in the dead of night. This was the way. It took 9 days. 9 days for the creatures to evolve from this. 9 days for them to build immunity to light. 5 more days for their numbers to go back to how it was. This was the last shot, and it failed. Governments broke down, people fled, and the creatures reproduced. Mass evacuation was implemented. The entire continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa were infested. In 4 weeks, 2.7 billion people were evacuated. The only time in history. For the remaining people, There was no way left for them. That was 1 year ago. Humans went to war with those creatures and lost. But we were together. After a few months, it felt like life was relatively normal. In the night, out of the corner of your eye, you'd swear you saw something. Or you'd hear a leaf crunch out of nowhere. But there was never anything there. 1 entire year and 0 sightings of those creatures. At the start, the governments put in strict safety measures to prevent any of those creatures from popping back up. But now, nothing. It had been months since there was any effort. But I knew. Lots knew. In fact, everyone knew. If those things reappeared, there was nowhere else to go. It's been 13 months. I remember now. 13 months since the first sighting. I never stopped to think, despite all the sheer numbers, despite how many times it appeared on the news, forced to us. Those who got transformed. How did they feel? Did it hurt? Was it scary? Was it painless? Blissful, even? I'd laugh, but I don't think I'm able to anymore. Really, there was just one thing I never thought about. How slow the transformation was. I went into hiding 1 week ago, after the first sign appeared. Right now, half my body is already transformed. I'm doing the bare minimum to survive. I know I can't. I know I shouldn't. But I'm scared to die. No one can find me here. I made sure to erase any trace of my leaving. Everyone will think I've gone missing. I'll be long gone before anyone finds this note. I hope one day this reaches you. I can see the ocean. So vast. Endless, it seems. To my parents. To my friends. To my colleagues. To my dog. And most of all, to you. I'm sorry that I couldn't say goodbye. Story 4. I went to a wedding. The groom wouldn't stop smiling. I went to my cousin Ava's wedding a few days ago. I'm still processing what's happened. I'll try to get everything out as best I can. Ava has been dating some guy named Ethan for the past year. Being in their 30s, they sort of fast-tracked the whole marriage thing. I'd never met the guy, and I hadn't spoken to Ava in a few years. But what the hell, it was guaranteed to be a fun time. The groom walked down the aisle first. A tall, pale man in a dark suit. He stood at the front of the church and smiled. He smiled when Ava walked down the aisle. He smiled as they kissed, after being pronounced husband and wife. He smiled as they walked out of the church. It didn't strike me as weird until we got to the reception. When they entered, he was still grinning that wide grin with his perfectly white, straight teeth. But up close, it looked, I don't know, wrong somehow. He wasn't really engaging with guests. He wasn't talking or laughing. He was just sort of scanning the place, staring, grinning wide without it really reaching his eyes. I guess he's smiling for the camera, I told myself. Or maybe he's a little socially awkward, and he figures nothing will go wrong if he just keeps smiling. It got really weird, however, when they served dinner. I watched him sitting at the sweetheart table with Ava, shoveling chicken piccata into his mouth as he still grinned. Barely opening his mouth wide enough to get the bite, immediately closing it. Making loud, chewing noises as he chewed while grinning. Have you ever seen someone chew their food while grinning? It is completely unnatural looking, smiling with your mouth closed, sure, but showing all your teeth grinning as you chew? It was so fucking weird. They eventually came to our table to say hi. I couldn't tear my eyes away from his face. He was still grinning. His wide blue eyes were jittering from person to person at the table. His face looked like a mask. There was no warmth. It was like looking at a statue. I whispered this to my sister once they left. There's something seriously wrong with him. Why is he smiling like that? My sister thought I was being a catty old maid. Well, old mister. Shut up. He looks fine. No, he doesn't. He looks like he's madly in love, she snapped back. Stop being jealous. Geez, Matt. That hurt. It honestly did. None of the other guests seemed to think anything was wrong. They thought it was all fine. Him grinning through the first dance, through the speeches, through the fucking champagne toast. He tilted the champagne flute into his grinning mouth without spilling a drop. Somehow. This is so weird. I excused myself to use the bathroom. But that was my first mistake, not realizing he had disappeared from the dance floor. As I was washing my hands, a stall door swung open behind me. In a mirror over my shoulder, I saw Ethan standing there. His skin looked milky white in the bright lights. His blue, bulgy frog eyes stared at me, and he was smiling. I don't mean that he saw me and then smiled. No, when he opened the stall door, he was already smiling. He walked over and began washing his hands at the sink right next to me, even though there were 3 other sinks. Our shoulders bumped. "Great wedding," I mumbled, trying to be friendly. He turned to look down at me. Slowly, his blue eyes bored into mine. My heart began to pound. "Music's great, too," I said nervously, to fill the silence. He just stared at me. That's when I realized. He hadn't said a single word the entire wedding. There were no vows. He just nodded when the officiant asked if he took Ava as his wife. He didn't thank the best man after the speech, and I hadn't even seen him talking to Ava at the sweetheart table, just smiling and staring. I backed away. His eyes tracked me as I went. Just as I reached the bathroom door, he stretched up to his full height and stared down at me. He looked even taller than he had in the reception hall, somehow, under the fluorescent lights. Then he stopped smiling. As his face relaxed, his cheeks sagged. His forehead drooped. The skin of his face began to shift and slide. I froze as his face began to pull and separate from his skull. He grinned, and everything stretched back into place. I finally leapt into action and darted out the bathroom door. I went back to my sister and grabbed her arm. "We have to get out of here," I breathed. "Ethan, will you shut up already?" she said, barely even looking at me. And then Ethan sauntered in, long legs taking him smoothly across the dance floor. He slowed as he passed our table, on his way back to Ava. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder. It's been 3 days. The skin of my shoulder is pulsing with pain, like it's infected somehow, and I can't help but notice, every time I look in the mirror, my face looks a little saggier, a little looser, like it isn't quite attached the same way anymore. So I've started smiling more, just to hold everything in place. Story 5. We found a cave on my grandmother's property. What's inside needs to stay hidden forever. I was 17 this summer. We found a cave on my grandmother's property in eastern Kentucky. I have never told this story to anyone. Not my wife. Not a therapist. Nobody. Sealing the cave after Grandma Edith passed should have helped, but it did not. What Chester and I saw down there has never let go of me. I was what you'd call the nerdy kid back then. Thick glasses, skinny as a rail, the type who spent lunch periods in the library. Every summer, my parents shipped me off to Grandma Edith's farmhouse in the foothills of the Appalachians, figuring the mountain air would be good for me. The house was everything a city kid like me thought was cool about the country. High ceilings, creaky wooden floors, wraparound porches, and dense forest in every direction. The nearest neighbor was Chester's family, and their place was nearly a mile down the dirt road. Past that, nothing but trees and hollers until you reached the county highway. Chester was a year younger than me, and he was everything I wasn't. He could fix engines, hunt, fish, and navigate the woods like he'd been born to it. Where I was pale and awkward, Chester was sun-darkened and confident. Where I worried about everything, Chester just did things. We'd become friends the summer before, mostly because we were the only kids for miles, and boredom breaks down barriers. He taught me to shoot his BB gun and which berries were safe to eat. I helped him with his summer reading and showed him how to use his family's ancient computer. "John, you worry too much," he'd say when I hesitated at creek crossings or complained about spiderwebs. "It's just the woods. Ain't nothing out here gonna hurt you." I wanted to believe him. Chester made the forest feel like his backyard, and his confidence was infectious. Around him, I felt braver than I actually was. That summer, we were both restless in the way teenagers get when the days are long and the possibilities seem endless. We'd already built a rope swing over the creek, explored every deer trail, even tried to build a tree house that collapsed before we got the roof on. We needed something new, something bigger. We just had no idea what we were about to find. We found it in the 3rd week of July, during a brutal heat wave that made the air shimmer and even drove the birds into shade. Chester and I were wandering the property, desperate for something to break the monotony. "Man, there's got to be something we ain't explored yet," Chester said, wiping sweat from his forehead. We were on the ridge at the back of Grandma's land, where the trees were thick and the underbrush hadn't been touched in decades. "Maybe the creek again," I suggested, though we'd been there twice already that week. "Nah, that's boring. We need something new." Chester stopped and pointed. "What's that?" I squinted. Through the foliage, I saw a darker shadow, something that didn't fit the natural pattern of trunks and branches. I squinted where he was pointing. Through the dense foliage, I could make out what looked like a darker shadow among the trees, something that didn't quite fit the natural pattern of trunks and branches. We shoved through brush, scratched by thorns, and wrapped in spider webs. Chester led the way, while I followed and complained about the bugs. "Quit whining," he called. "You want to find something cool or not?" In the hillside, we found a depression about 15 feet across, and at its center the mouth of a cave, half covered by a rusted iron grate. Time and weather had rusted most of it away, leaving gaps just big enough for nosy teenagers to squeeze through. "Holy crap," Chester breathed, the first time I'd ever heard him sound impressed. "John, look at this." I crept closer. The opening vanished into blackness, a cool breeze drifting out with the smell of damp earth and something I couldn't place. "Think it's an old mine?" I asked. Chester shook his head. "Nah, wrong kind of rock. Limestone country. It's a cave. A real cave." He was already kneeling at the gap, peering into the dark. "We should tell my grandmother," I said. "She'd just tell us to stay away." He grinned, the kind of grin that meant trouble. "Come on, just a quick look. We don't have lights. My phone does." I wanted to argue, but Chester was already squeezing through the gap. His movement echoed strangely inside. "Chester, wait up," I called. Being alone outside seemed worse than following. "Just for a minute," his voice came back, muffled and strange. "Just to see what's here." I slipped through after him, scraping my shoulder on the rusted metal. The passage opened immediately into a chamber 10 feet high and twice as wide. Chester's phone light swept over smooth limestone carved by water through the ages. "This is so cool," Chester whispered, and his voice echoed back at us from deeper in the cave. The floor was mostly level, covered with a layer of dirt and small rocks that crunched under our feet. Chester played his light ahead, revealing that the cave continued back into the hillside much further than either of us had expected. "Okay, we looked," I said. "Now let's go back and get real flashlights if we want to explore." But Chester was already moving deeper, his phone light bobbing as he walked. "Chester, just a little further," he called back. "I want to see how far it goes." I followed. The alternative was standing alone in the cave mouth, and that wasn't happening. We made it 50 feet before Chester's phone died. The darkness swallowed us whole, the kind you never get in a city. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. "Chester," my voice sounded small. "Right here. Don't panic." His hand grabbed my arm. "Stay close. We'll follow the wall back." We shuffled for 5 minutes along the wall, trying not to trip. When daylight finally appeared, we were both shaking, though neither admitted it. "That was awesome," Chester said, though I heard the relief in his voice. "It goes back really far," I said. "Yeah, we need real lights and rope. Explore it properly." I nodded, though something about the cave felt wrong. Maybe it was the darkness or the way our voices echoed. "Tomorrow," Chester said, "we'll come back with supplies." As we walked back through the woods toward the house, I kept looking over my shoulder at the cave mouth behind us. Even with the afternoon sun filtering through the trees, that dark opening seemed to pull at my attention. I should have listened to that feeling. Should have told Grandma Edith, or just found something else to occupy our time that summer. But I was 17, and Chester made everything seem like an adventure, even the things that should have scared us away. We came back the next morning loaded like explorers. Chester had his dad's heavy flashlight, a coil of rope, and glow sticks from his birthday. I brought a headlamp, extra batteries, chalk for marking our path, and a notebook to map it. "You sure like to be prepared," Chester said at the cave entrance. "Better than getting lost." He was already squeezing through the gap. "We won't get lost. We got lights this time." With real light, the cave felt different. What had seemed mysterious in the dim glow of Chester's phone now looked like a normal limestone cavern. Water had carved smooth channels into the walls, and the floor sloped gently down as we moved deeper. "This is way bigger than I thought," Chester said, sweeping his light around. Several passages branched off, each fading into darkness. We spent an hour exploring the obvious routes, marking chalk arrows and dropping glow sticks. Chester sketched a rough map while I called out measurements. "The left passage goes about 60 feet and dead ends," I said. "The right passage curves back and connects with the center, like a loop." The center passage drew us in. It ran straight back, sloping steadily down, and our lights couldn't find the end. "That's where we need to go," Chester said, his voice excited. 2 hours in, he made the observation that should have sent us back. "You notice anything weird about this place?" he asked, studying the walls. "What do you mean?" "No bats. No bugs. Nothing." His light swept the ceiling and walls. "Every cave should have bats at least. Spiders, crickets, something. But look, nothing." I stopped and looked. He was right. The place was sterile. No cobwebs, no droppings, no life. Even the puddles were clear and still, with none of the algae you'd expect. "Maybe it's too far from the entrance," I said. Chester shook his head. "Nah, caves are ecosystems. There should be something living here." We kept going. We were too caught up in the adventure to let a little oddity stop us. The cave was giving up its secrets, and we felt invincible. The center passage dropped 100 feet over 300 yards. Our chalk marks and glow sticks glowed faintly behind us. Then Chester spotted the elevated passage. "John, look up there." I followed his flashlight beam to where the wall rose to our right. About 15 feet up was another opening. Unlike the others, it was perfectly round, 4 feet across, with a steady current of air flowing out. "Feel that breeze," Chester said, moving closer to the wall. I felt it. Cool, mossy, damp, but with something else underneath. Something I couldn't place. "We can't reach it," I said. "Not today, but with a ladder. Or rope." He was already planning our next trip. I stared at the dark hole, uneasy. The air was too cold, carrying scents that didn't belong in limestone. "I think we should head back," I said. "We've been down here a while." Chester checked his phone. "Yeah, past lunch. Your grandma's probably wondering." We followed our chalk arrows and glow sticks back to the surface, faster this time. Sunlight hit like a flood, and I had to squint against it. "Tomorrow we will bring a ladder," Chester said. "Maybe we should tell someone where we're going," I suggested, "in case something happens." He gave me that look again, the one that said I worried too much. "Nothing's going to happen. It's just a cave." But as we walked back through the woods, I kept thinking about that opening and the air flowing from it. The scent felt familiar, like something half-remembered from a dream. That night, I dreamed of deep places and moving air, and woke with the taste of moss in my mouth. Chester showed up the next morning with his dad's aluminum stepladder strapped to the four-wheeler, grinning like he had solved everything. "Borrowed it while Dad was at work," he said, wrestling it off. "He won't miss it for a few hours." The ladder was heavier than it looked, and hauling it through the woods was an expedition in itself. We stopped every 50 yards to rest and untangle it for branches. By the time we reached the cave, we were both sweating. "This better be worth it," I muttered, helping him force it through the grate. "Trust me, it will." Getting the ladder down the sloping passage was another challenge. It was awkward in the tight space, and my headlamp cast confusing shadows. But Chester was determined, and we finally got it against the wall. "Hold it steady," he said, climbing. I braced it while his light swept the opening above. At the top, he went quiet. "What do you see?" I called. "It goes back a long way," he said, muffled. He climbed down, and we switched places. The ladder felt shaky under me, but I reached the opening. His flashlight had shown the tunnel stretching back, but what struck me was the sound. Water, dripping, echoing as if from a much larger space. "You hear that?" I called. "Yeah, sounds like water. A lot of it." I climbed down, and we stared at each other in the glow of our lights. "Underground river," I said, "or a lake? Only one way to find out." The elevated passage was more open than I expected. We could walk upright, the walls smooth, limestone worn by water. The smell grew stronger as we moved, and the air felt thicker, carrying scents that reminded me of things long dead. After 200 feet, the passage opened. I have spent years trying to find words for what we saw, and I still cannot do it justice. The cavern was vast, the size of a cathedral, with walls fading into darkness. In the center was a lake. The water was black and still, like a mirror reflecting nothing. Our lights reached only a few inches, and when Chester tossed in a pebble, the ripples died too quickly, as if the water swallowed them. "Jesus," Chester breathed, his voice echoing from the ceiling above. I swept my headlamp around the edges. The far shore was almost beyond reach, maybe 50 feet away. How deep do you think it is? Chester asked. I don't know. Deep. He was already digging in his pack. Let's find out. He cracked a glow stick, tied it to a rock with a rubber band, and tossed it in. The green light sank, and sank, and sank. It never reached the bottom. The glow vanished into the distance until the surface was black again, showing no trace of what we had dropped. That's not possible, Chester said, his confidence gone. I stepped back for the edge. The lake felt alien. The air too still, the silence too complete. Even our voices seemed muffled, as if the water absorbed them. We should go back, I said. But Chester was staring at the far shore, his light barely catching shapes in the dark. There's something over there, he said. On the other side. I looked. In a faint circle of light, I saw what might have been structures on the rock. Regular shapes that did not look natural. Chester, let's go back and think about this. We need a boat, he said, ignoring me. An inflatable raft. We could paddle over. The thought of being in that water clenched my stomach. That's crazy. We don't even know how deep it is. What if we fall in? We won't. I'm a good swimmer. In a lake that might not have a bottom. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw he felt it too. The sense we had found something that should not exist. But Chester never backed down from anything. Tomorrow, he said, we'll think tonight and come back with a plan. As we left through the passage and down the ladder, I kept looking back. The darkness seemed deeper than it should, and I felt something in that water watching. That night, I could not shake the image of the glow stick sinking into endless depths. In my dreams, I sank with it into darkness, so complete I could not tell if my eyes were open or closed. Chester showed up the next afternoon with a small inflatable raft strapped to his four-wheeler, the kind meant for lazy rivers. He also had life jackets, waterproof flashlights, and a hand pump. Where'd you get this? I asked, though I already knew. Borrowed from my cousin Jake. He won't miss it. I eyed the raft. It was 6 feet long, built for calm water, not underground lakes. Chester, I don't think that's going to work. It'll be fine. It's rated for 2 people. We're light. Despite my doubts, I helped him haul it to the cave. His enthusiasm was hard to resist, and I was curious about the far shore. But the image of that glow stick sinking into black water never left my mind. Launching took longer than we expected. The rocky shore wasn't ideal, and we had to clear stones for a spot. The whole time, I was aware of the water beside us, still as obsidian and reflecting our lights. Are you sure about this? I asked. It's just water. Worst case, we get wet. But it wasn't just water, and we both knew it. The lake felt wrong. No lapping at the shore, no movement at all. Even when disturbed, the ripples died too fast, as if the water was heavier than it looked. Chester climbed in first with a flashlight. The raft barely dented the surface, as if it floated on something solid. Come on, he said, steadying it. I climbed in reluctantly, paddle in hand. The moment we pushed off, I felt the lake take hold of us. It wasn't like floating, more like being suspended over an abyss. Paddle, Chester said, shining his light ahead. The rowing was strange. The water gave almost no resistance, yet the raft crawled forward, slower than it should have. It was like paddling through oil, though the water looked and felt normal when I touched it. This is taking forever, Chester muttered after what felt like 20 minutes. I looked back and my stomach dropped. The rocky ledge was much farther away than it should have been, barely visible in our glow. Ahead of us, the far shore seemed no closer than when we'd started. Chester, something's not right about this. Just keep paddling. We're almost there. But we weren't. The harder we paddled, the less progress we made. The far shore stayed distant while the shore behind us kept receding. It was as if the lake stretched itself, bending distance in ways that defied sense. Then Chester's light touched the far side, and we both went quiet. What the hell is that? He whispered. I don't know, but I don't like it. The structure was 30 feet across, ringed with strange stone pillars. The rock was darker than limestone, smooth and almost metallic. Carved channels ran toward the water, and in the center stood something like an altar, though it was built for no human shape I could imagine. We need to get closer, Chester said, but without his usual confidence. "No, we need to go back. Now." I turned the raft, but he grabbed my arm. "Wait, look at the water." I followed his gaze. The water glowed faintly, as if light rose from something far below. The glow was subtle but unmistakable. The surface shifted, a slow bulge rising as though some unseen current was pushing up from the depths. "There's something down there," Chester said. "Something big." Then our gear failed. Chester's flashlight flickered and died. My headlamp dimmed despite fresh batteries. Even my watch froze at 3:47. "Chester, we're leaving." "Now," I said, cracking a glow stick. He didn't argue. We paddled hard toward what we thought was shore, but the darkness pressed in and our failing lights showed almost nothing beyond the raft. Then we heard it, a sound from beneath us, deep and resonant, like rock and metal groaning under pressure. It rose from the depths and vibrated through the water and into our bones. Ripples spread across the surface and faded too quickly. The raft shuddered. "Paddle faster," Chester said, and for the first time I heard fear in his voice. The sound came again, closer. The water around us began to glow, the light moving upward as if something vast was rising. We paddled in silence, our failing lights barely cutting the dark. The shore seemed impossibly far, and with every stroke I was sure we would not make it. But somehow we did. The raft scraped the rocks just as my headlamp died. We dragged it out and collapsed on the cavern floor, shaking in the shine of our last glow stick. "We can't tell anyone," Chester said finally. "They'd think we were crazy." I nodded, though part of me wondered if we were. The whole thing felt like a nightmare. As we packed up, I made the mistake of looking back. The water was still again, but I was certain something in that blackness was looking at us. For 3 days, I avoided the cave. I stayed close to the house, helped Grandma with chores, even started reading one of her old romance novels just to keep busy. But Chester would not let it go. He showed up with a restless energy I had never seen. "You can't just pretend it didn't happen," he said one Thursday morning on the porch. "We found something incredible. We found something dangerous," I said. "Our lights failed, Chester. All of them. At the same time. So we bring backups. More batteries. Better lights." I looked at him and realized what I had mistaken for confidence was obsession. He could not sit still. Dark circles under his eyes showed he was not sleeping. "I need to go back," he said, leaning forward. "Don't you want to know what it was?" "No, I don't." Chester stood and paced to the edge of the porch. "Fine. Then I'll go alone." "You can't. Watch me." I felt trapped between two choices. Let Chester go alone or return to something I wanted to forget. The thought of him down there by himself was worse than my fear. "If I go with you," I said, "we go at dawn. We bring extra everything. And at the first sign of trouble, we leave. No arguments." Chester grinned, hollow. "Deal." That afternoon, we gathered supplies. Chester had found a larger raft, more stable than the first, borrowed from my sister's boyfriend. We packed flashlights, batteries, glow sticks, rope, even a first aid kit. Looking back, it was an expedition, not an adventure. "One more thing," Chester said as we loaded the four-wheeler. "I want to actually reach the far shore this time. Get a closer look." Every instinct screamed no, but I had committed, and despite my fear, I was curious. The shapes we had seen haunted my dreams. I needed to know. The forest felt different on the way back. Quieter. Even the birds were silent. We slipped through the grate and down to the lake, our equipment heavier with every step. The cavern was as we left it, vast and still. The water stretched into darkness, smooth as glass. Against every survival instinct, I helped him launch the boat. The crossing dragged, and with each stroke, I was more certain we were making a mistake. But something was different about the far shore. "Are those lights?" I asked, squinting. Chester raised the binoculars and went still. "There's something over there." "What?" "On the far shore. I see movement. And you're right, there are lights. Not flashlights. Something else. Something that glows." I snatched the binoculars. In the distance, a faint blue-green glow flickered, like the bioluminescence in the water. "Chester, we're turning around right now," I said, handing them back. My voice was a hoarse whisper. He looked through them again and gasped. Chester had gone completely silent. His mouth moved, but no words came at first. Then, in a whisper that grew louder, he began repeating, "It comes out of the water. It goes into the water. It comes out of the water. It goes into the water." I shook him, but he wouldn't stop. His eyes were fixed on the far shore, wide and shining, as though he was watching something emerge that I couldn't yet see. That's when the water around us began to glow. The luminescence rose from the depths like we'd seen before, but this time it was brighter, more intense. And in that growing light, I could see the true scale of what lay beneath the water. It wasn't a lake at all. It wasn't a lake. It went down forever. A well, a portal, an abyss eternal and bottomless. Vast and deep. Alien light. Forever and ever. I screamed. I know I screamed because my throat was raw afterward, but I couldn't hear the sound over the roar of blood in my ears. Chester was screaming too, or maybe laughing. I couldn't tell which. The eye blinked. The entire cavern shuddered as something the size of a mountain moved beneath us. Water that wasn't water displaced around us, and our tiny raft was suddenly riding waves that shouldn't exist in an underground space. This shook Chester out of his fugue. We both dug our paddles into the glowing surface, fighting against currents that felt more like muscle contractions than water flow. As we stumbled out of the boat onto the shore, I made the mistake of looking back. The eye was there, staring up at us through bottomless layers of water that should have blocked any light. And in that ancient gaze, I saw recognition. It saw us. It saw into us and through us. Something in Chester's mind shattered. I could see it in his eyes. I grabbed him and dragged him down the tunnel. We abandoned the raft and ran for the passage, leaving our carefully gathered equipment scattered on the cavern floor. Up through the elevated passage, down the ladder we didn't even bother to retrieve, through the cave system toward the blessed light of day. We burst from the cave into afternoon sunlight that felt impossibly bright and clean. Chester collapsed immediately, retching onto the forest floor. I managed to stay upright long enough to drag him away from the cave entrance before my own legs gave out. Chester was never the same after that day. His laugh, the easy confidence that used to pull me along into trouble, all of it vanished. He hardly spoke, and when he did, it was whispers about water and eyes that never stopped watching. Before the summer was over, his parents sent him away to a hospital in the big city. Someplace special, they said, though they never used the word I knew they meant. I never saw him again. At first I thought he'd come back the next summer, that we'd pick up where we left off like nothing had happened. But his absence became permanent, a hollow space I couldn't fill. I carried the weight of it alone, pretending normal life was still possible while the memory pressed against me like the dark water under the hills. That was 10 years ago. I've been in therapy on and off ever since, cycling through doctors who nod sympathetically when I tell them about recurring nightmares of black water and watching eyes. They prescribe medications for anxiety and sleep disorders, but nothing stops the dreams completely. Chester wasn't as lucky. The last I heard, he was living on the streets, talking to things that weren't there and insisting that something was still watching him. When Grandma Edith passed a year ago and left me the house, the first thing I did was hire a contractor to seal the cave entrance with concrete and rebar. I told him it was a safety hazard. I paid him extra to use twice as much concrete as necessary and to never mention the job to anyone. Some doors, once opened, need to be closed forever. Late at night, I swear that sometimes I can still hear the sound of water moving far beneath the ground. Story 6. My neighbor's front door has been wide open for 2 days. Since it was a sunny Friday afternoon, I didn't think much of it at first. It was 5:30, and I had just returned home from work. When I saw that my neighbor's front door was open, I assumed that she was simply unloading something from her car. I went inside my own house and went through my usual after-work routine, going for a run and then making dinner for my wife, Alice, and me. It was only in the evening that I began to suspect something was wrong. I was taking our dog, Bailey, out for her final walk of the day. It was nautical twilight, my favorite time to be outdoors. I've always enjoyed strolling around the block with Bailey in those last, precious moments when there's still enough light to see the horizon. I put Bailey's harness on her as she excitedly hopped around. Then the two of us stepped out into the cool night. After a few seconds, I looked up and noticed that the door to my neighbor's house, the one directly across the street, was still wide open. Also strange was the fact that, despite her car being in the driveway, the house was completely dark, not a single light on inside. I crossed the street. My neighbor is a 20-something named Isabel. She seems like a sweet girl, but we aren't exactly good friends. Sometimes I give her lemons from our tree in exchange for figs, and that's pretty much the extent of our relationship. Still, the sight of that open door made me uneasy. What if she had some kind of medical emergency and was currently unconscious, or worse, on the floor of her entryway? After a few steps up the driveway, the leash in my hand went taut. Looking down, I saw that Bailey had seated herself firmly on the ground, refusing to budge even as I called her name and tugged on the leash. Her ears were pricked up, her eyes fixed on the house like she was waiting for something. Though she wasn't growling, I was unnerved by her alert posture and her refusal to walk any closer to the door. I let my voice close the distance between us and my neighbor's threshold. "Isabel, it's Brian from across the street. Can you hear me?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to drop Bailey's leash and walk up the steps to the house, there came a voice from the dark. "Hey, Brian," she said before coughing once and then clearing her throat. "Sorry, I'm in the middle of dinner here. What's up?" I breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey, sorry, I just saw that your front door was open. Wanted to make sure you knew." Strangely, there came another long pause. I knew she was inside the house now, and close enough to the door to hold a conversation with me. "So what was the delay?" "Isabel. Oh, you're so sweet to check in." "Yes, I know it's open. It's just been so hot today that I want to let the breeze in. I'll close it soon." "Of course. Have a good night, then." "You too." With that, I tugged Bailey back down the driveway, and the two of us completed our walk. I returned home, happy that my neighbor was all right, and went to sleep. Saturday was a much-needed lazy day. I woke up at 10, ate the breakfast that Alice made, then spent some time in the backyard with her and Bailey. It was an overcast day, and by 3 p.m. or so, a light rainfall forced us back inside. Alice took a call from her sister, who lives at the edge of our neighborhood, while I went to the living room to throw on some television. Except, before I could get comfortable, I looked out the front window and was surprised to see that Isabel's front door was open again. Open again? I wondered, or was it never shut? I got up close to the window and studied the house across the street. The rain was coming down harder by then, and the thick, gray clouds overhead made it seem like nighttime. Despite this, there wasn't a single light on inside of Isabel's house. It was so dark inside that the entrance to her house seemed less like a door and more like a black, painted rectangle on the exterior wall. I turned to look at Bailey, who was laying on a nearby couch, and saw that she was also looking out the window. Ears pressed against her head, she glanced at me briefly, then refocused her attention outside. I couldn't tell if she was simply people watching, or if, somehow, she too could sense something wrong. Just then, Alice walked into the living room. She was no longer on the phone, and she greeted me with a strange, almost nervous smile. "That was an odd conversation," she said, taking a seat next to Bailey. "Everything all right?" "I don't know. Clara saw a woman peeking into her house a few nights ago." "What? Creepy, right?" "And she's not the only one. Apparently, there have been a few reports on her side of town, other people experiencing the same thing. Nothing stolen and no one hurt, at least that Clara knows of. But it's still pretty weird. Let's make sure we lock up extra well tonight." My thoughts drifted to my neighbor. I asked my wife what this woman looked like. Like I said, Isabel and I weren't close, but I knew she had recently gone through a difficult breakup with a long-term boyfriend. It was far-fetched to assume a connection between Isabel and the mystery woman, but who knew? Heartbreak makes people do crazy things. Maybe there was some link between the two. Alice hesitated for a minute. "Well," she eventually said, "you know Clara. She's got a real, superstitious way about her. She's always telling stories." "What does that mean?" "It means you've got to take this with a grain of salt." When Alice relayed Clara's description of the woman, I felt a chill run down my spine. Clara said that the woman was tall and gaunt, enough so that she originally mistook her for a man. She said that her skin looked too tight across her face, and that her eyes looked unnaturally deep-set, as though they were too far back in her skull. Apparently, when she saw that Clara had spotted her, she had given Clara a big smile before retreating into the night. Apparently, when she smiled, she had too many teeth. I was silent for a moment, unsure what to make of Clara's morbid sighting. Love, was Isabel's front door open this morning? She considered my question as she pet Bailey. I think it was. If nothing else, I figured I should at least tell Isabel to be careful. I put on my raincoat and headed outside, carefully making my way down the wet driveway. Once I made it to the sidewalk, I heard frantic barking coming from behind me. Turning around, I saw Bailey in the window, her paws resting on the sill, her growls and whimpers rising over the heavy rain. My wife appeared next to her a few seconds later. She attempted, unsuccessfully, to comfort Bailey, giving me a questioning look as she did so. I gave her a shrug in return, then crossed the street. I stopped at the bottom of Isabel's porch steps and listened. Like before, I could hear someone inside, though I couldn't tell exactly what was going on. I heard a deep, wet ripping sound like something being torn. Also like before, I couldn't see anything inside the house. A voice called out from the dark interior. "Brian." "Hello again," I said, only wondering in retrospect how she could have known it was me. "Sorry to bother you again, but I wanted to tell you something. Would you mind coming out for a minute?" "Brian," she repeated, tone almost reprimanding. "This isn't a good time. You always seem to catch me in the middle of a meal. It won't take long." I tried persuading myself. When she didn't respond, I climbed up a few steps. "Isabel, there's been some suspicious activity around the neighborhood recently. I know you like to keep the door open for the breeze, but maybe you oughta keep it shut today." "Ah, but I'm so comfortable here on the couch. Why don't you close the door for me?" "The couch?" Wasn't she in the middle of a meal? Even if she were eating on the couch, her voice sounded so close, like she couldn't have been more than a few feet away from me. Was she hiding behind the door? I climbed up the rest of the steps, tried to recall the inside of her house from the 2 or 3 times I'd been inside. I knew that the room immediately to the left of the entryway was the living room, and most likely where Isabel was supposedly sitting. I also knew that there was a light switch right next to the front door. What the hell, I thought. I'll just go inside for a minute, say hello, and then shut the door for her. It'll give me some peace of mind to actually see her instead of just hearing her voice. I glanced over my shoulder toward my own house. Bailey was still barking her head off, which was unnerving, but the sight of Alice keeping an eye on me gave me some peace of mind. It was just a house, I told myself. Just a normal house with my own neighbor inside of it. Taking a deep breath, I stood at the threshold, shocked at how, despite my closeness, the inside of the house remained pitch black. I thrust a hand inside, and it disappeared like I'd dipped it into oil. As I groped around for the light switch, my fingers brushed against something solid, something fleshy. I jerked my hand back, certain that I'd just touched a person. "Isabel," I asked the darkness, and then, from inches away, came the sound of laughter. The laugh was deep, gravelly, and mocking, and it did not resemble my neighbor's voice in the slightest. Before I could react, I heard the quick pitter-patter of footsteps against wood. It grew quieter and quieter, and I realized that it was the sound of someone running away from me. After a few seconds, I thought I heard a door open and shut in the distance. The back door, perhaps? Again, I stuck my arm inside, and this time I was able to find the light switch. I turned on the light and was relieved when the interior of the house revealed itself to me. A normal entryway with a normal coat rack and a normal shoe rack. No eerie intruders in sight. However, the relief was short-lived because when I stepped inside the house, I turned to the left, walked into the living room, and was greeted by the sight of my neighbor. Or at least, what was left of her. She was splayed out atop a couch, her head lolled off the side. Her empty eye sockets and toothless, wide-open mouth looked like 3 holes had been dug into her face. Her face itself was red, not, as I initially thought, because it was covered in blood, but because it was missing its skin. She had been flayed. Not only her face, but her arms and the top part of her torso. It looked like someone had been methodically working their way down her body until I had interrupted them. Paralyzed by fear and confusion, I stood in place. I waited to wake up from a nightmare. I waited for Isabel to walk in from an adjoining room and tell me that I was looking at a Halloween prop. I waited for a dangerously long time, and then I staggered out into the rain. When I returned home, I immediately called the police, though I had trouble putting what I'd seen into words. They arrived quickly, took my and Alice's statements, and then went across the street to investigate. It's been days now. They haven't told me anything, despite my repeated calls to the station. I can't get answers, can't sleep, can't eat. I just keep replaying the discovery over and over in my mind. The voice, the feeling of brushing against a body in the dark, and of course the sight of that poor girl's mangled corpse. I have too many questions to count, but 3 rise above the rest. Who the hell was I talking to? How do they sound so perfectly like my neighbor? And why is it that every night since I found the body, Bailey hasn't stopped sitting by the front door and growling? Story 7. The Halloween Tunnel. Scaredy cat, tease Carmen. It's the least frightening haunted house on the planet, and you're still too chicken to go in, hissed Michelle. I glared at the pair of 8th graders. Ever since I arrived at James Garfield Middle School, they'd taken it upon themselves to bully me relentlessly. It didn't matter that our classes didn't overlap, as I was 2 years their junior. They always found ways to harass me during school events and field trips, as well as after hours, during which they waited for me to be alone, or at least away from any adults. It generally stuck to insults and put-downs, but they weren't beneath going further when they could get away with it. I'd come home with plenty of cuts, bruises, and pain in my scalp for where they'd pull my thin black hair. They'd size me up as soon as I'd enter the school bus. I was new. I read the wrong books, usually weird stuff about magic and the occult. I lived in the wrong area, one that was a substantial step down from the neighborhood with its own country club earlier on the bus route. I was late to hit puberty, rendering me smaller and less developed than my peers. And I was deeply claustrophobic, as they learned when they locked me for several minutes in a supply closet, prompting me to scream my heart out. My dad kept telling me that if I just ignored them, they'd eventually leave me alone. But it was advice that I gradually realized was naive. Sure, some bullies will lose interest if you don't give them the reaction they want. But not these ones. On this particular occasion, it was Halloween. Our school took the holiday relatively seriously, condensing the day's class schedule and reserving the final 2 hours for festivities. Due to rain, the event largely transpired in the school gymnasium. The room was filled with seasonal activities, apple bobbing barrels, pumpkin carving stations, and even a dunk tank with a target that resembled a spider web and a giant jack-o'-lantern-shaped base. The vice principal and an elderly teacher, both remarkably good sports, took turns sitting inside. They were dressed as a pair of witches who, according to local lore, wreaked havoc on our Pennsylvania community centuries ago. I wish I could have enjoyed the event as much as my peers. But the echoing noise and the prospect of being stuck in a room with a large crowd quickly sent me fleeing. Before long, I found myself in an adjacent corridor where a small number of students perused a few less popular attractions. I walked to the end of the hallway, where I saw that the music room had been transformed into a makeshift haunted house. Great, I thought. There was virtually nothing I hated more than haunted houses. I didn't mind the spooky decorations. In fact, I had a soft spot for them. What I hated was the idea of not knowing where I was, of not being able to see, and of being stuck in confined spaces where, at any moment, someone in a costume might jump out at me. Seeing nothing else to do, I sat against the wall and waited for the event to be over. That's when Carmen and Michelle came along. They followed me there. At first, they pestered me for being alone. What a surprise, finding the class weirdo here all by herself, snickered Carmen. No, I just wanted to see what was over here, I lied. Michelle's face formed a skeptical expression. If that's the case, then why are you sitting down? She glanced at the music room entrance, then back to me. You know what I think? I think you're too afraid to go in there. Little Miss terrified of everything. No, that's not a dash. Michelle's right, chimed in Carmen. You're too scared. You're like the biggest wimp I've ever seen in my life, jeered Carmen. Just pathetic. Leave me alone, I whimpered. Leave me alone, mocked Carmen, adopting a comically high-pitched voice to mimic my own. We're going to tell everyone that you're too much of a coward to go into the world's least scary haunted house. They carried on like this for several minutes. As they did so, 3 students emerged from the haunted room. They looked well happy. As they headed back towards the main event in the gym, they talked and giggled excitedly amongst each other. Certainly, they didn't seem the least bit bothered by what they'd encountered. I let out an annoyed moan as I realized that the path of least resistance was just to give Carmen and Michelle one less thing to bully me about by walking through this stupid attraction. Even with all my phobias, how bad could it honestly be? Look, I'll do it, okay? Whatever, Michelle retorted. Like we really give a shit what you do. Just know, though, that if you chicken out and try to leave, we'll be here waiting and we'll see it. Same goes if you come running out screaming or having one of your pitiful little panic attacks, hissed Carmen as she removed her phone from her pocket. Everyone will have a video of it by morning. I'll be fine, I muttered. And with that, I pushed open the door marked entrance. Before me, a combination of boxes, music stands, and bookshelves formed a corridor adorned with plastic spiders positioned on fake webs. As haunted houses go, it was certainly mild and kid-friendly. I did my best to control my fear as I pressed onwards. Ms. Jensen, the music teacher, had certainly put a lot of effort into the environment. Plastic ghosts dangled from a ceiling. Prop graves, complete with fake hands reaching out from in front of them, littered the ground. The overhead lights flickered dimly, and what visibility I had was impeded by the fog emanating from a mist machine. Some of the props moved or made noises, or both, when they sensed my approach. The path continued to a Halloween tunnel, formed of canvas held up by arched PVC pipes. A giant clown face covered its entrance, such that entering it resembled crawling into its mouth. There was no way around it, at least not without turning around or shoving bulky furniture out of the way. I shuddered. As if the poor visibility wasn't enough, I now needed to enter a confined space, just as I'd feared. This will all be over soon, I told myself. If I turn back now, they'll make fun of me forever. I took a deep breath, dropped to the carpeted floor, and crawled inside. I placed one hand before the other and steadily made my way forward. Some decorations, mostly skeletons and pumpkins, all placed above the tunnel, were visible through the translucent canvas. But as I made more progress, the light started to fade to the point that I could only see a few inches in front of me. I kept thinking that I was about to reach the exit, but the exit never came, even as I was sure that I'd traversed the full length of the room. As my body started to tire, I struggled to imagine how a tunnel this long could even fit in the area where it had been located. Perhaps if it wrapped back onto itself in a snake-like form. But I hadn't sensed any turns. As far as I could tell, I was moving continuously in the same direction. This kept going for a long time. Eventually, I realized I was sweating profusely, and not just because of physical exhaustion. Panic swept over me. What if I got stuck here, as impossible as that was to rationalize? What if no one found me? I imagined the walls, which I could barely see, closing in upon me, and the oxygen in the stale air I was breathing slowly disappearing, leaving me to suffocate. My mind started to drift away, and I grew dizzy. That's when a thought belatedly occurred to me. I had my house keys in my pocket. It would take a little effort, but I could use them to cut a tear into the thin canvas and force my way out. If I was somehow wrong about all this, if I wasn't stuck in an impossibly endless tunnel, I could deal with the consequences of damaging Ms. Jensen's prop later. It was at that moment that I first heard it, a shrill cackle that reverberated through the tunnel. As it repeated, my surroundings tremored, as if shivering in fear. At first, I thought it was coming from behind me. I quickened my pace, only to hear it ahead of me, too. That's when I realized that it was coming from both directions at once. LYDA, echoed the eerily high-pitched voice ahead of me, which stretched my name into 3 syllables. LYDA, echoed an identical voice behind me. At first, I wondered if it could be Carmen and Michelle playing tricks on me. But that thought faded when, ahead of me, 2 bright red eyes pierced the darkness. I gasped as the glow they cast revealed a face half covered with ancient skin. No skin at all covered the other half, exposing the figure's chalky, white bone underneath. I looked backwards, only to see two similar eyes from a similarly decayed face glaring at me from several yards behind. "Why so afraid?" they asked in unison. I shook all over. I tried to croak out a response to them, but I couldn't muster the words. Whatever these things were, I didn't want to be anywhere near them. Then something miraculous happened. Or, at least, it seemed that way to me at the time. The tunnel split off, with a new pathway opening to my right. Without a moment's hesitation, I turned and crawled as fast as I could. Obviously, none of this made any sense. But I was caught up in the moment as my survival instincts kicked in. In the distance, I spotted light. Could there be an exit ahead? As I clambered forward, I imagined the hideous figures close behind me. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted. I just knew that I couldn't let them catch up to me. Finally, an exit appeared. As I climbed to my feet amidst blinding light, I felt aches all over my back and legs. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was back in the corridor outside the music room. Thank God, I thought, feeling a sense of relief. It was short-lived. I shrieked as pain seared through my lower leg. I turned to see a decrepit, veiny hand reaching out of the tunnel. It had long, sharp fingernails. Blood, my blood, dripped from one of them where it had cut me. For a brief moment, the two revolting faces peered up at me from the tunnel with looks of pure hatred and malice. I wasn't safe, and they were still following me. As I sprinted away, I screamed for help. Only, there was no one to hear me. As I passed by the cafeteria and into the gymnasium, I encountered no students or teachers. The whole building was eerily vacant. The only new feature was the dust. Layers upon layers of it, several inches deep in many places, that caused me to cough and sneeze as my feet kicked it up. Finally, I reached the main door to the outside. I pushed frantically at it, but it wouldn't budge. I realized, to my frustration, that it was chained shut. Another set of loud cackles rang out, their echoes resounding through the hallway. I grimaced as two figures appeared. Once again, they were on either side of me, both at a far end of the corridor where I was stuck in between them. Both figures were, or at least once were, women. But now, both their clothes, a low-neck gown on one, and a gray dress and petticoat on the other. Their bodies were tattered, revealing patches of bone and dry, sickly skin. They both had stringy, gray hair, and they both appeared to levitate a few inches off the ground. I watched as the one to my left suddenly dived into the thick dust that covered the floor, disappearing from sight. I turned to my right to see that the other woman, too, was gone. That's when the floor close to me rumbled. My heart sank as both figures emerged less than a yard from me, each wielding a sharp dagger with a wooden hilt and a double-edged blade. Dust covered their forms, and they both emitted what sounded like a furious attack cry. I ran once again. Before long, I found myself crouched in a small nook in the back corner of the library. I was caked in sweat and dust, and it took several minutes for me to fully catch my breath. As far as I could tell, I'd managed to shake my pursuers, but I doubted I'd elude them for long. The cut on my back leg, which I desperately needed to clean, was still dripping blood. Questions ran through my mind. Why was the school so empty? Perhaps I'd been lost, or stuck somehow in that tunnel for longer than I'd realized, and everyone had gone home. But if that were true, then how did all this dust get here? Had I slipped into some sort of alternate reality? And who were the two people, or whatever they were, pursuing me, and what did they want? A thud drew my attention as a book from the shelf that bordered my hiding spot fell and landed on the nearby floor, sending up a small cloud of dust. Its cover displayed in bright red letters, The Story of Lydia. It didn't list an author. I picked it up. The cover, binding, and typeface were all extremely old. The table of contents, meanwhile, consisted of a list of people, all of whom, at various points in my life, had mistreated me. I flipped through the rest of the book. It described incident after incident when someone insulted or bullied me. The girl who'd ripped open my stuffed animal at summer camp. The girl who'd shoved me to the ground on the playground. The girl who told me that nobody liked me, and that even my father was just pretending. The teacher who'd falsely accused me of cheating. And, over again, the following words appeared after each description. Lydia did not fight back. The last section recounted everything Carmen and Michelle had done to me, from routine snubs and put-downs to outright violence. Once again, the chapter closed with the words Lydia did not fight back. By the time I reached the end, I was steaming with rage, both at the many people who'd mistreated me and also at myself for not standing up for myself and, in a way, sometimes enabling it to happen. Again and again, I let people walk all over me. When I closed the book, I saw 3 numbers, 211, written on its back cover followed by a phrase handwritten in red ink, "Only if you have what it takes." I instantly knew what 211 meant. It was my locker number, located on the 2nd floor. When I reached it, my usual combination worked. Inside, at the bottom of the locker, was a dagger identical to those I'd seen both members of the duo wielding earlier. Underneath, it was a note in the same handwritten red ink as on the back of the book. It read, "They want to kill you. Fight like your life depends on it." I resolved to return to the tunnel. It struck me as my best ticket back to reality. Once in it, I'd crawl back to the juncture, and if no exit was apparent, I'd cut through the canvas. As I walked, I half expected an ambush by the 2 phantoms. But I didn't care. I was done hiding. If they tried something like that, I'd try to fight them off. I'd defend myself or die trying. Of course, this raised the obvious question: who dropped the book next to me in a library, or created it for that matter, and who led me to the dagger? Was someone here looking out for me, and if so, why? As I neared the corridor containing the entrance to the music room and the exit from the tunnel that had brought me here, I noticed a figure in the distance. She was pacing and covered in dust. I dived for cover, successfully managing to avoid alerting her to my presence. I dropped to a crouch and, once I could tell that she was facing the opposite direction, quietly crept towards her. The air in the corridor was thick, and the light was so dim that the figure was little more than a dusty silhouette. She's one of them, I told myself. This is my chance to catch her by surprise. My life depends on pulling this off. As I narrowed the gap between her and me, a rage inside of me began to fume and boil over. I wasn't seeing a person. I was only seeing the target of years of pent-up hatred. The figure was entirely masked in gray dust, and as I got closer, the smell of mildew and decay that clung to it blocked out all other thoughts. These 2 undead women were only the latest in a long line of people who'd never gotten their comeuppance for what they'd done to me. That was going to change, starting now. I raised the dagger and pounced. The events that followed passed in a blur. I remember cries of shock and pain, dust flying in the air, followed by spurts of blood, a body crashing against the floor. I remember dropping my dagger as I dove into the tunnel, crawling, racing toward a distant light. The sounds of cackling close behind me, then further away, then faintly fading. I remember emerging into the haunted music room at the end of the school day, bursting into the hallway outside, too frantic to notice or care who was there to see me, and running through a door and into a downpour outside. I didn't care about the rain or the thickets that scratched me as I rushed through them. By the time I got home, I was drenched and exhausted, and there were cuts on my clothes and skin. I knew that telling the truth wouldn't get me anywhere with my dad. So, by the time he got home from work, I'd showered and thrown my filthy clothes into the laundry, and I had an explanation for the cuts that involved slipping in the mud and falling into a thick shrub. I avoided any Halloween festivities that night. Instead, I lay on my bed trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, I considered the possibility that it had all been an anxiety-induced hallucination. I recalled how I'd grown dizzy and nearly lost consciousness while in the tunnel. At that moment, had my mind just combined my worries about Michelle and Carmen with a local legend about witches that I'd been reminded of only a few minutes prior? Yes, I had a gash on the back of one leg, but couldn't it be a scratch left from the thorny plants I'd gone through during my frenzied journey home? My mind slowly settled on this explanation as making more sense than any alternative. That all changed when I got to school the next morning and learned that Michelle was missing. Worst of all, she'd seemingly disappeared while on school grounds the previous afternoon, which contributed to dozens of uniformed police officers prowling the building throughout the day. 2 of them spoke to me privately. Apparently, Michelle had gone into the haunted room after me. According to the officers, she was concerned for my safety, after realizing I'd been in there for quite some time. I knew that this was something Carmen had told them, and that Michelle's motivations had more to do with finding an excuse to further humiliate me, but I kept that to myself. I answered their questions coldly and succinctly, offering nothing about the bizarre journey I'd gone on or the two apparitions who'd chased me in some parallel world. Eventually, they let me go. "What did you do to Michelle, you freak?" Carmen screamed at me during lunch that day. To the shock of everyone else in the cafeteria, I gave her a bloody nose with an abrupt blow to the face. I didn't care about the detention that followed, my subsequent grounding for 3 weeks, or my father's stern lectures and disappointed looks. What I did care about was that Carmen never messed with me again. I'm no longer the same person I once was. That person ceased to exist when I realized that the dust-covered figure outside the tunnel was no ghastly witch. When I took out years of frustration and anger, not on the entities I believed wanted to kill me, but rather on a school bully who merely wanted to pester and embarrass me, who'd follow me through the tunnel for that very purpose, who 2 witches had let pass into their realm to be sacrificed not by them, but by me. That person, my old self, died along with Michelle as I stabbed her again and again before leaving her body in a distant place where I knew that it would never be discovered. I wasn't even surprised when, several days later, another book appeared in my locker. After all, I'd caught on to why these spirits, these witches of the distant past, had taken such an interest in me, and I finally had a good idea of the purpose behind their actions. Namely, they had been testing me, and I'd passed with flying colors. I was eager to claim my reward and to finally become part of something greater than myself. This book was filled with spells and incantations. I'd read spell books before, but this one was different. This, I knew instantly from the authentic feel of its ancient, grimy pages and the ominous aura I sensed in it, was the real deal. It detailed the steps necessary to carry out many forms of dangerous, dark magic. It was the kind of book people had good reasons to burn. And yet, this particular book had survived and even made its way to me. Familiar handwriting inside its front cover read, "Welcome to the Coven. You'll be hearing from us again, soon enough, dearest Lydia." Story 8. The woman I disemboweled had something strange in her abdomen. 24 hours into my shift, I was tired, exhausted. My eyelids dragged shut of their own accord, and every time they closed, strange patterns crawled in the dark behind them, writhing like things alive. Just one more note, I told myself, and I'd be free to go home. I typed the last of the vitals, closed the laptop, and considered whether I should eat before collapsing into sleep. My body begged for food, but the thought of swallowing anything filled me with unease. Still, I rose and began the slow trek down the stairs toward the cafeteria. The hospital at dawn is unlike any other place. The lights hum like insects trapped behind the ceiling tiles. Shadows lean across the sterile floors, and every cough, every shuffle, echoes far too loudly in the corridors. That was when I saw her. In the lobby, a woman slumped in a wheelchair. Her skin was waxen, her hair slicked to her temples with sweat. Her eyes, half-lidded, unfocused, reflected nothing, as if light itself recoiled from them. A man stood behind her, glancing between her face and the indifferent receptionist at the desk. I could have kept walking. I wanted to. My stomach twisted with hunger, my bones ached with fatigue, and yet something about her made turning away impossible. I stepped closer. My pulse quickened with each stride. The man noticed me first. "Doctor, please." My wife, Amanda, was nauseous this morning. Her doctor gave her an admission order, but while we were waiting, she got worse. They gave me a wheelchair, but his words blurred. My attention was fixed on Amanda. Her lips moved, forming broken, animal sounds. I pressed my fingers to her wrist, searching for the reassuring throb of life. What I found was not reassuring. Her pulse stuttered beneath my fingertips, 30 beats per minute, irregular like the faint ticking of some clock winding down. Her breath rattled, her skin damp and clammy. Her eyes fluttered, then rolled slightly upward. Shock. In the middle of the lobby, surrounded by people, no one had noticed she was dying. I looked at the receptionist, who barely glanced up from her screen, irritation etched across her face. Rage flared in me, though I didn't recognize it as my own. It felt borrowed, implanted. Without thinking, I ordered the man to follow me and wheeled his wife toward the emergency department. We did not run. Running would have turned the moment into chaos. Instead, we walked slowly, as though in a procession. I asked questions, illnesses, medications, history, but my voice trembled. I am only an intern, I thought. If she goes into asylum now, I'll have to. I stopped the thought. I did not want to imagine CPR in that long hallway under the humming lights. We reached the ER doors. I cut through the man's explanation to the receptionist. Code red, Brenda. Open the doors. Now. She obeyed, and the doors yawned wide. Inside, the attending roused from half-sleep, and within moments the room filled with nurses, monitors, voices. We laid Amanda down, wires snaking across her body, screens flickering with numbers that painted her death in real time. Heart rate, 30. Blood pressure, 60/30. Respirations, shallow, uneven. Her husband spoke of nausea, of vomiting blood earlier that morning. I pried her mouth open, saw the black crust of dried blood on her tongue and teeth. The smell that poured out was not merely iron and bile. It was ancient, rank, the kind of scent one imagines seeping from catacombs unopened for centuries. Her abdomen was distended, rigid, silent as stone. I pressed my stethoscope to her flesh, and for a moment I imagined I could hear something, not the hush of peristalsis, but a faint, whispering murmur, as though the body contained not organs but voices. The monitor beeped, 29 BPM. Atropine now, the attending barked. The nurse obeyed. The numbers crawled upward, reluctantly, like a creature stirred from slumber. 30, 31, 37, 40. Amanda moaned, each sound leaving her in a rhythm too precise, too ritualistic, like prayer to some forgotten god. I leaned toward attending. It may be a perforated ulcer. He ordered an ultrasound. The black and white image revealed free fluid throughout her abdomen. She was bleeding, drowning in herself. She would need surgery. Go fetch the chief, he told me. I obeyed. The chief came, looked once at the monitor, then made a call. As soon as she's stable, we'll stop the bleed. 30 minutes later, Amanda was deemed stable enough for the OR. As we wheeled her down the corridor, I felt the walls draw closer, the fluorescent lights flickering as though dimmed by her presence. In the operating room, I introduced myself to Dr. Roberts, who led the case. He nodded. We'll need your hands. Dr. Brown will assist as second surgeon. We scrubbed, donned gowns, and began. When the first incision was made, a smell erupted, not the acrid tang of cauterized flesh, but a stench older, heavier. It clawed its way into our sinuses, made our eyes water. It smelled of earth, of graves, of something left to rot in silence for centuries. We opened her abdomen. Darkness spilled forth, blood black as tar oozed from within, but it was not merely fluid. It was alive in its stillness, drinking in the light, bending the edges of the room. We worked deeper. The cavity stretched unnaturally, as though her body contained more space than it should. Dr. Roberts and Dr. Brown lifted the intestines out and pressed them into my hands. I should have felt the gentle rhythm of peristalsis. Instead, the coils twitched in violent, jagged spasms, as if something inside them struggled to escape. Sweat soaked my mask. My heart stuttered. I gripped the mass with trembling fingers, desperate not to drop it. Then erupted. Intestines, blood, feces burst outward, not with the chaos of an accident, but with the inevitability of birth. The room was drenched. My glasses saved my eyes, but when I wiped them clear, the sterile field was gone, drowned in filth. The others stood frozen, their faces twisted in horror. They had no eye protection. Their eyes were wide, staring, reflecting the impossible sight before us. Amanda's abdomen had become a mouth. It widened, stretched, and from it poured not organs, but something else, something that bent the room. The lights bent toward it. The floor seemed to ripple beneath it, and the walls bowed inward. It was not a form, but many. Faces melted together, mouths opening and closing, tendrils writhing and splitting into anatomies unimagined. It was intestines, and it was not. It was flesh, and it was something older than flesh. The thing touched the surgeons, and they did not scream. They did not blink. They simply froze, their pupils swallowed by black. The door opened. Someone entered, drawn by the noise. That sound broke my paralysis. I fled. I ran until my lungs seared, until bile rose in my throat, until I collapsed heaving in the corridor. Now the surgeons lie in the ICU, comatose. Their faces are still twisted in the same grotesque shapes I saw in the OR, as though frozen mid-horror. Their bellies swell. Sometimes they twitch in unison, in rhythms I do not recognize, yet I feel in my bones. They ask me what happened. The chiefs, the attendings, the nurses. But even if I spoke, they would not believe me. I know this much. Amanda was never the patient. She was the vessel. And what we released that night was not meant to be seen by human eyes. Story 9. Boneless Bob. As a twin, I often found myself watching my brother Robbie and thinking, this is my face when I'm laughing, or this is my face when I'm crying. I'd seen my face reflected back at me, through him, across nearly the whole span of human emotion as we grew up. We never got tired of looking identical. We kept the same haircuts, we swapped clothes, we pranked our friends. But as we prepared to head off to college, I began to brace myself for the inevitability that we would start to look different. Maybe I'd grow a beard, maybe he'd grow out his hair. He was always threatening to go and get himself a mullet. Maybe he'd finally do it. I found myself wishing senior year would never end, that we'd never have to leave the nest, go to schools on different sides of the country. In a fucked up monkey's paw type way, I got my wish. Our grandfather had a massive heart attack, followed by a surgery that was going to take months to recover from. It happened just as we were making dorm arrangements, and both of us were able to defer our schooling for a year. Robbie had wanted to take a gap year anyway, but our mom talked him out of it. So hey, now we had one more year at home. Our gap year was far from restful, though. Robbie already had a gig waiting tables, and mom's job paid well, so I took up the role of caregiver. I tried to keep our grandpa, Bobby, on the path to recovery while Robbie and mom worked overtime to keep us from drowning in hospital bills. Bills that would have been much higher if we had to hire a caregiver. So I knew I was helping, but there were so many days I felt guilty just reading and watching over Bobby while they sweated the hours away. Of course, there were the bedpans and changing bandages and the stress of remembering medications, but I didn't mind. I wanted to be a doctor back then. I just figured that was all stuff I'd have to learn anyway. Once you embrace the fact that the body is just a messy vessel, and that everyone is a little bit gross, it's not so weird. Plus, it helped that Grandpa was pretty out of it when he needed the really invasive care, and by the time he was himself again, he could bathe himself again, too. And it was during this time, when he still needed me around all the time, but the worst of the danger had passed, that we grew closer than we'd ever been. Sure, I'd visited with Grandpa growing up, I'd listened to his stories, played baseball with him, all that stuff. But those deep conversations that adults can't have with us until we're grown up had yet to take place until that summer. We talked about everything. And though baseball was out of the question, we played chess and checkers, and I even showed him a few video games. He was pretty terrible at those, but it helped pass the time. As Grandpa recovered, the medical debt stabilized, and Robbie and Mom were able to relax a bit, too. They cut back their hours, and they even found time to enjoy the last little bit of summer. Just a bit. Robbie and I even talked about going to school in the winter with how fast things got better. But we wanted a proper freshman experience, so we started making plans to enjoy the rest of our gap year. And although I didn't need to visit Grandpa as much anymore, I found myself heading over to his house whenever I got time. As summer turned to fall, Grandpa began to confide in me more and more. Between walks around the neighborhood and board games, he began to tell me some things that he'd never told anyone else. Not even my dad, who died when he was not much older than me. Though that was probably just because he'd always thought that there was more time, that he'd tell his son those stories later. Grandpa told me about World War II, though I suspected he was still sanitizing those stories somewhat. He told me about growing up in the shadow of the Great Depression, his parents always preparing for starvation, instability. And finally, we worked our way back to his own childhood and he told me about his own grandfather. Grandpa's grandpa had been Robert the First, and while Grandpa didn't know him very well at all, he finally worked his way into telling me that there was something he'd always wanted to get off his chest. When Robert the First was on his deathbed, he'd started to confide in Grandpa, just like we were doing now. Only Robert had been much older, and the stories he told Grandpa were much scarier. Grandpa said that there were some stories that were clearly nonsensical, just the product of whatever sickness of the mind plagued Robert in those final years. But there were some stories that were more grounded, that Robert had repeated over and over again. And with those stories, Grandpa had always regretted not pressing more, not looking into them more, because those stories were about death. They were about death at Robert's hands. Robert told Grandpa about a house in the woods where he would go to feed the beast. He always used that phrase. He'd tell Grandpa about bringing people there, about covering up their disappearances. But whatever the beast was, Robert would never tell Grandpa. And whatever happened to those people in that house in the woods, well, Robert took that to his grave. Before long, Grandpa and I were going to the library and digging through old survey maps of the city. We found an old address owned by Robert on a road that no longer existed, and soon we were able to pin down the approximate area where Robert's house in the woods would have been. But that presented its own set of problems because the spot was in the woods just north of an old marble quarry. Being in the city, you'd think it would be a relatively small spot of woods. But no, it was part of a tract of land known as Area X that had long been the subject of debate in our city. See, Area X was a massive patch of woods, but a stretched-out one. It ran along a hillside going down into the river, so developing it would have taken serious money. Every now and then, the city toyed with making it a park or something. But Area X also served as an unofficial boundary between one of the poorest parts of town and one of the richest, and I suspect the rich folks wanted to keep it that way. So it sat in a strange limbo of possibility that was never realized. Grandpa and I combed through old maps of the place and compared them to the most current satellite maps. But with how much the city had shifted, it was hard to pinpoint where his grandfather's house would have been. In satellite maps that had been taken in the fall and winter, we pinpointed little remnants of structures in the trees. Old concrete foundations, shacks along some nearby railroad tracks, and patches that had been cleared for something, but it was hard to tell exactly what. Robbie swapped back today to shift at his job, and he started coming over, helping us with our silly quest. And of course, right away, we decided to hold our own little expedition into Area X. I picked up my own job by then, just interning in an office, which never overlapped in Robbie's weekend-heavy schedule. So we had to pick a day we both got off just a few hours before sunset. We packed backpacks heavy, like we were going to the dang Amazon or something. We brought snacks, water, a first aid kit, and camping knives. We were ready to bushwhack through the wilderness. There were two ways to get in. From the south, sneaking in through the quarry, or from the north, which, as far as we could tell, just bordered a small riverfront park. As ready as we were to sneak around, we opted for the northern entrance, and we soon discovered that Area X was far from the undiscovered wasteland we'd been picturing. We were expecting to cut through the woods for the half-mile or so between the park and the unofficial boundary. But instead, we found the entrance paved with a wood chip trail. There were no signs, no trail markers, but people had been there. The trail led into a clearing with little teepees and stick fences built. That has been a huge trend in the wild spaces around our city lately. Hipsters making little tents and sculptures out of fallen wood. I expected the trails to taper off after the clearing, but the paths beyond had been well established. We decided to head left at any of the forks, realizing quickly this would not be an expedition we could knock out in one day. The paths took us to shallow, crumbling cliffs, and as we walked along, we spotted a few small caves. We crawled in them, of course. Caves are pretty rare in our part of the world, and they ended quickly. But splashes of graffiti inside them told us that this was a well-traveled place. The cliffs themselves betrayed a more ancient history. All along the river, where the water has eroded the landscape more, you can find fossils breaking free. It's just seashells and trilobites and those weird coral-looking things, but they were fascinating, and we spent longer than we should have looking through them. After we explored the caves and the cliffs, we hit a bougie apartment development and turned back. That's the thing about Area X. It's long but not wide, and civilization is only maybe half an hour away. With the river on the other side, it's not somewhere you can ever really get lost in. We kept going along the main path for a little bit after that, a path that was well worn by many feet over many years. And we stopped when we hit a spring. It was coming up out of the ground, and the water was crystal clear but smelled vaguely sulfurous. Someone had built a little wooden bridge going over it, even though there wasn't much point, as the spring was only a few yards wide. But it added to the charm of the place. We spotted orange peels and sporadic holes scattered around, the remnants of picnics and fires. The spring was right on the edge of where the forest turned to prairie, and as we spotted the sun dropping low across the field, we realized we'd probably come as far as we should for the day. When we got back, I tried to look up any information I could find on Area X, but there wasn't much there. There was a geocache somewhere and a few internet forum posts about a waterfall that had an old, decaying VW bug. But there was nothing official. It was like it was a secret park, claimed by everyone over the years who saw such a vast stretch of wilderness in the city, and knew there had to be something cool in there. Grandpa had the idea first. All the old maps we'd been looking at had inspired him, and he said we should map out Area X. We set up shop at his office, moving some of his art stuff. He'd been an illustrator back in the day, before he started to get issues with his hands and wrists. But he still had all the equipment, drafting desks and fancy pens and pencils. And he helped us make a big outline of Area X on a huge piece of butcher paper. We set up location tracking apps on our phones, and with that, made a plan to try and map out as much as we could before winter came. We also hoped that maybe along the way we'd find the remnants of great-great-grandpa Robert's old house in the woods. It was so exciting. It felt like we were going on a quest for treasure, even though the treasure at the end, should we find it, might be dark family secrets, perhaps literal skeletons. We planned out more expeditions, always on days where Robbie was getting off work early enough that we'd have enough daylight. Rain or shine, we went to Area X on any day we could, and every time we found ourselves fighting the sunset, waiting until the last possible minute to turn back. It's all a blur now, what we discovered in which expedition. There were 3 main trails that ran the length of the area, one down by the river, one closer to civilization where the terrain turned into prairie, and one right down the middle of Area X that ran along a long raised ridgeline. That trail was my favorite, because it was just so strange. The ridgeline didn't make any sense, really. It reminded me of the ancient earthworks we had in our part of the world, walls built that used to mark the boundaries of prehistoric cities. As we explored further and further in Area X, I even spotted an area where the ridge path had eroded a bit more, and out of it spilled tightly packed stone slabs. Then I started to wonder if the trail we walked on, the ridgeline that made no sense, was an undiscovered earthwork, because Area X was easy to get into from the north and virtually impossible to get into from the south without sneaking through the quarry. It tended to get more wild the further south we went. The trails became more overgrown, and we'd find older and older things. And as we mapped it out, we'd report back to Grandpa and give him all the pictures we took. He'd add to the map for us, recovered enough to start drawing again, just a bit. The arthritis, or whatever it was, had never been able to completely stifle his creativity. He drew in different landmarks like they were spots on the map of some fantasy world. There was the geocache, a rusted old box with wet notebooks, that looked ancient and charming when rendered in pen. We never did find the VW bug, but we found tires at the bottom of a waterfall on the low trail. Grandpa dubbed that Tire Falls and added it to our map. My favorite landmark was a tree we called the oldest honeysuckle in America because it was massive. See, honeysuckles are invasive. They're from Japan originally, and they took off in America, crowding out a lot of the less hardy undergrowth. Since they're newer, you don't get really ancient ones that often, especially since they get trimmed down in places with sensitive plants. But in Area X, in a truly unmonitored wild space, they'd gone crazy. They grew over each other, forming curved branch tunnels. In spots with more sun, they reached up high, and the oldest one, the special one, was the biggest one I'd ever seen. It branched straight up like a tree, the trunk of which was bigger than me. We had a few other old trees marked down, mostly old sycamores that grew on the lower path by the river. That's one thing I love about my city. Because the river is a pain to build around, you get these weird little patches of ancient forest. They hold trees so massive they look like the ones you see in pictures of lumberjacks making their way through America in its infancy. We found 2 different old house foundations, but if they were Robert's, they didn't have anything there besides old concrete slabs. There was a spot where there used to be an old parking lot, but it was cracked through so much that the forest had mostly taken it back. There are other small springs coming out of the earth and other miscellaneous remnants of civilization. We found little ropes and log staircases connecting the paths back to each other along the slopes. We mapped everything out. We saw other people on occasion, usually closer to the north side. They all walked with purpose and confidence. It was a place that inspired repeat visits. I was starting to feel like we'd found just about everything. So we once again turned to the library and the internet to try and pinpoint the exact location of Robert's old house. The game changer was when one of the librarians who specialized in local genealogy showed us how to use an old newspaper database. It wasn't like in the movies, where you needed to flip microfilm over and hope for your big break. We could just type in Robert's full name, and the answers we were looking for, well, they popped right up. I think in mapping out Area X, we kind of gotten lost in the whimsy and the fun of it all, and we'd forgotten about the grim reality of what we were actually searching for. Right away, the headlines told us that what Grandpa had suspected might have been true. Robert I had never been arrested, obviously, but what Grandpa didn't know was that he had been a suspect in several local disappearances. One headline even called him Bob the Butcher. And though no one, not the police or the families of the missing, could ever prove anything, there was plenty of dirty laundry to sift through in the news. One woman recalled going on a date with Robert, only for him to try and drag her off into the woods. She escaped, but he didn't really get into trouble, and another article about the woman even went out of his way to note she was known to dress provocatively. Another article was from a girl in a state whose father had gone to work for Robert. He'd never returned, and though he'd sent a note saying he was going to Canada for another job, she thought the handwriting looked rather strange. In total, there were at least 3 other people mentioned in multiple articles, and dozens of others just mentioned here and there in speculation. We struck gold when we got to the articles about the police investigating Robert, though. Several of the articles had little maps drawn of Robert's house and the old dirt road that used to run out to it. They were inconsistent, but we were able to pinpoint things much more exactly than before. A string of late shifts from Robbie put our adventures on hold for a few weeks, so I went back to hanging with Grandpa for a bit. He taught me how to draw, and he opened up a bit more. In between learning different leaves and how to ink them out, he told me stories from the war. Stories I'd always felt were censored a bit before, but now I heard them in their full graphic detail. The stories that haunted Grandpa the most were the ones about his own comrades. Grandpa had expected death from the enemy, carnage in battle. But what he'd never expected were the things his fellow soldiers did between the battles or in the aftermath. Men who seemed perfectly nice, perfectly ordinary, who'd shoot a child in the head on a whim, then go back to pawing around like nothing had ever happened. Grandpa then told me that he wouldn't be surprised at all if we found something gruesome near Robert's old house. He believed that all men are capable of terrible things. They just don't always find the right place and time to do them. When Robbie and I geared up for what would be our last expedition into Area X, it felt so much like our first one. We were going to spend the night, so we brought food, water, and camping supplies. The tentative spot was halfway between the ridgeline path in the middle of Area X and the high path near the prairie. And it was so far south, it was almost at the quarry. I was hopeful we might actually find something, and that it might be relatively undisturbed. We took the ridge path in the middle because it was impossible to get lost. The other trails were starting to get obscured by falling leaves. As we neared the quarry, more and more jagged rocks poked out of the hill, like the spine of some massive snake was being slowly exposed. As we walked closer and closer to our own old family secrets, I wondered about the possibly ancient secrets beneath our feet. If the ridge path was along an old earthwork, there might be bodies below us as we walked. Bodies that would only be exposed hundreds of years from now, when the erosion from the path destroyed the earthwork completely. Robbie and I started that trip joking and laughing and got more and more quiet the closer we got. Migrating geese and crows filled the silence, replacing the songbirds of summer. We stopped to put our jackets on before we left the path, both to protect our arms from branches and to keep the approaching night chill at bay. We spotted the house after just a few minutes, the forest having hidden it from us even though we'd been so close before on a few different trips. It was still intact enough to call it a house, but when we actually got inside of it, we saw that not much had survived except for the floor and the walls. It was just a brick and metal crumbling skeleton. We wandered the grounds outside of it for a bit, and we did find some neat stuff. Some old leather book spines that had survived the ages, some kitchen utensils, a big meat cleaver that was rusted to hell. I'm sure there was a lot more hidden in the leaves. But as the sun began to set, we decided to bed down for the night. We set up our tent in the ruins of the old house and made a fire. Robbie was tired. The long shifts at work had been getting to him. He'd been neglecting getting a haircut, and he had stubble coming in. It was strange to see him starting to look different from me for the first time ever. It made me deeply sad because after our unexpected gap year, we'd finally be apart. It felt like we were reliving our senior year all over again, dealing with emotions we'd already dealt with. We talked about everything that night. Life in college and Grandpa. What it would be like if we were shipped off to war at his age. How you never know what's waiting for you out in the world, good or bad. I don't know how long we talked like that for. Hours maybe. And then the wind picked up, and we started to smell something awful. It was the scent of rot, the sickly sweet smell of maggots and death and old meat. We waited for the wind to shift, to take the smell back away, but it didn't. The trees around us swayed, dropping more and more leaves that shone red and orange before they fell into the fire. Despite the smell, I felt content for just a minute there, ready for whatever our future was going to throw at us. Because even though we'd be far away, we'd still have each other. And then we both fell silent at once, sensing something nearby. I'd always heard people describe that feeling, but I'd never experienced it. It was like a sixth sense telling us that danger was near, that we were not alone. I scanned the gaps in the crumbling walls, waiting for eyes to reflect back at me, and I saw Robbie looking behind me as well, doing the same. The trees creaking above drew my eyes north, and I watched the peeling white sycamore branches draw closer over the tops of the bricks. Only something about them was strange. Wet red and black leaves hung down like they'd been dredged up out of the river, and the branches were moving against the ones behind them. The smell became unbearable, and I leaned over to dry heave. It was only a second, but when I looked back up, the tree branches had come down into the ruins of the house. And only when they wrapped around Robbie did I recognize them for what they truly were, long skeletal fingers. In the flickering firelight, the massive hand picked Robbie up as if he weighed nothing. It pulled him up over the wall. I sat there in shock for just a few seconds until Robbie started screaming. Then I ran out and saw the full extent of the beast. It was a massive thing, made up of splintered bones and decaying flesh. It was hunched over Robbie, and I watched it slice open his leg with one knife-sharp claw. I didn't know what to do. I ran over to it, slamming it with my backpack, thinking maybe I could distract it. But it just swatted at me, its massive bones crumpling my chest. I landed facing the creature, smashed against the side of the house. And when Robbie got his breath back enough to scream again, I tried to move, but I couldn't. Too many things inside me were broken. I wanted to close my eyes, but I felt it was my duty to witness what happened, to be able to tell people how Robbie died, even though later, no one would believe me. As the thing shifted around, I made out ribs, a spine, and limbs, all made up of smaller bones stuck together with gore. It was a massive beast, a colossal skeleton made up of hundreds and hundreds of other bones. As it worked on Robbie, slicing him open, it added his bones to its body, drenching the foul, decaying mass with fresh blood. Listening to Robbie scream, I thought that there could never be a worse noise, that nothing I'd ever hear in my life would compare. But when he stopped screaming, that was worse because I knew what it meant. Eventually, Robbie stopped struggling, and the creature smashed his head in one quick hit that shook the ground and sent a wave of pain through my own broken bones. It picked up bits of Robbie's skull to add to its own, a skull being made up of hundreds of rounded fragments all stitched together. It didn't seem to know how teeth worked, as it placed a few skull bits in its mouth to add to a maw full of jagged edges. It had left eye holes for itself, but when it turned to study me, there was nothing in them. Instead, it leaned in close and tested my torso with one sharp claw. But whatever it felt there, it didn't like it. It left me alone and grabbed what was left of Robbie's carcass. Then it wrung out his body like it was a rag and poured fresh blood over its head. And finally, it stood to its full height, towering over the trees, and tossed what was left of my brother in the direction of the river. I waited there all night and most of the next day before they found me. And the whole time I lay there, all I could think about was why the creature left me alone. Was it because it's like an animal, and it had had enough to eat? Was it because it was some supernatural curse, and Robbie had been punished for carrying on the family name? Paying for the sins of our ancestors? Had a simple flip of a coin at birth determined that Robbie was going to meet his death in these woods? Or was it the beast that Robert the First talked about? A beast we hadn't known could be tamed, bargained with? I would have given it anything to spare my brother if I'd only known how. I wish I knew. I wish I had any answers. But what I do know is that the horrors that I saw that night will haunt me forever. As I watched Robbie getting sliced open, as I watched him taking his last breaths, I thought to myself, this is my face in unbearable pain. This is my face while I'm dying.